Islands are supposed to be the reward, the place you finally get to after the flight, the ferry, the long drive to the coast. These 10 are the opposite. Some are guarded by snipers, some by snakes, and one is guarded by a tribe that has made its feelings about visitors extremely, fatally clear. So today, we're counting down 10 forbidden islands you shouldn't even think of visiting. Number 10, the Farallon Islands, California. Just 30 miles off the Golden Gate Bridge, close enough to see from a hilltop on a clear day, sits a cluster of jagged rocks that spent 25 years as America's dumping ground for nuclear waste. The Farallones themselves have a grim reputation dating back well before the nuclear era, with sailors historically nicknaming them the Devil's Teeth for the treacherous rocks that have wrecked ships along this stretch of coast for centuries. Between 1946 and 1970, the Atomic Energy Commission oversaw the disposal of an estimated 47,800 barrels of low-level radioactive waste into the waters around the islands, from labs including Lawrence Livermore and the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory. Soldiers reportedly shot holes in barrels that wouldn't sink on their own, sending them straight to the bottom of a 300-square-mile stretch of continental shelf that sat, at the time, directly inside a major commercial shipping lane. That wasn't even the strangest part. The irradiated wreck of the USS Independence, a light aircraft carrier deliberately exposed to nuclear blasts during the 1946 Bikini Atoll tests, was towed to the Farallones afterward and scuttled nearby, quietly rotting on the seafloor for decades before researchers finally relocated it using sonar in 2015, discovering it remarkably intact, complete with aircraft still visible in its hangar bay. A 1980 congressional investigation found roughly a quarter of the recovered barrels already broken open and leaking, though officials at the time called the lack of obvious environmental damage more luck than good planning. Subsequent radionuclide testing on local fish and mussels in the 1990s found measurable contamination well above levels recorded almost anywhere else studied worldwide, even if it stopped short of proving a direct public health risk. The islands themselves are now a protected national wildlife refuge, home to one of the largest great white shark populations on the planet, with researchers tagging and tracking dozens of individual sharks that return to the same waters every fall. Access is restricted to biologists and researchers only, and even they typically stay for weeks at a stretch rather than making repeated trips, given how difficult and weather-dependent the crossing can be. Between the sharks and the plutonium, nobody's exactly lobbying for a day pass. Number 9, North Brother Island, New York. Tucked into the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island, this 16-acre island has been uninhabited since 1963, and getting there today requires written approval from the city's Parks Department, along with an escort plus a boat, since the old ferry dock has long since rusted into non-operation. For nearly 60 years before that, it served a very specific purpose, quarantining New Yorkers with diseases the rest of the city didn't want anywhere near it, at a hospital built specifically far enough offshore that no ferry rider or dock worker had to think about it. Riverside Hospital opened here in 1885 to isolate patients with typhus, tuberculosis, and smallpox, and its most famous resident, Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, spent roughly 26 years confined here across 2 separate stretches, the second one lasting until her death in 1938. She was the first documented healthy carrier of typhoid fever in the United States, feeling completely fine herself, while infecting at least 51 people as she worked as a cook under a string of aliases after her initial 1910 release, on the condition that she never cook professionally again. She broke that condition almost immediately, which is exactly why the second, permanent quarantine happened. Health officials tracked her down again in 1915 after a fresh outbreak at a maternity hospital where she'd taken a kitchen job under the name Mary Brown, and this time there was no negotiating a release. The island also witnessed one of the deadliest disasters in New York City history in 1904, when the excursion steamship General Slocum caught fire in the channel right beside it, killing 1,021 passengers, most of them women and children from a single church group on their way to a picnic. Today, the 25 surviving hospital buildings are, according to the city's own Parks Department, in such extreme disrepair that they pose a considerable threat to the island's visitors, which is a fairly polite way of saying don't, delivered by the one government agency that actually has the keys. The island now sits within a constellation of restricted and semi-abandoned sites scattered across New York's waterways, including nearby Hart Island, the city's own potter's field, where more than 1 million unclaimed dead have been buried since the 1800s. Herons and egrets have taken over the crumbling wards where patients once waited out quarantine, giving the whole place the strange feeling of a nature preserve that happens to still have hospital beds rusting inside it. Number 8. Surtsey, Iceland. Most islands on this list earned their reputation through disease or weapons. Surtsey earned it by being too scientifically valuable to let anyone near. The island didn't even exist before November 14, 1963, when an undersea volcanic eruption south of Iceland's Westman Islands broke the surface of the North Atlantic and started building brand new land in real time, eventually rising to nearly 570 feet above sea level over 3.5 years of continuous eruption, with ash columns early on reportedly visible from Reykjavik, more than 60 miles away. The island takes its name from Surtur, the fire giant of Norse mythology, said to set the entire earth ablaze at the end of the world, which is a genuinely fitting namesake for a piece of land that was, quite literally, born from fire. Iceland declared the island a nature reserve before the lava had even finished cooling, and access has been restricted to a small handful of approved scientists ever since, typically somewhere between 5 and 15 researchers a year. The entire point is to watch, completely undisturbed, exactly how life colonizes brand new land from absolute zero, and it's worked. Scientists have documented the arrival of seeds carried in by ocean currents, mosses spread by bird droppings, and eventually full nesting colonies of puffins and fulmars, all without a single tourist boot ever touching the ground to muddy the data. By 2004, researchers had already cataloged 60 vascular plant species and nearly 90 bird species using or passing through the island, an astonishing rate of natural colonization for land that was molten rock less than half a century earlier. Surtsey earned UNESCO World Heritage status in 2008, officially cementing what was already true in practice. This is one of the only places on Earth where scientists get to watch an ecosystem build itself completely from scratch, and they are not about to let anybody ruin the experiment by wanting a selfie. Erosion is slowly chipping the island away, roughly a hectare a year according to some estimates, meaning Surtsey is expected to persist above the waterline for centuries yet, quietly shrinking while remaining exactly as off-limits as the day it finished erupting. Number 7. Vozrozhdeniya Island, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. Once genuinely remote, this island in the middle of the Aral Sea was chosen by Soviet military planners in the 1930s specifically because nothing could survive its harsh, arid climate for long, which made it the perfect place to test biological weapons designed to kill people. The island was first surveyed by a Russian naval expedition back in 1848, decades before anyone imagined what it would eventually be used for. Starting in earnest in 1948 and formally designated Aralsk 7 in 1954, the site tested weaponized anthrax, plague, smallpox, tularemia, brucellosis, and botulinum toxin in open-air conditions across 7 dedicated test zones, with a nearby town housing around 1,500 scientists, soldiers, and their families in total secrecy for decades, as part of a wider Soviet bioweapons program that reportedly employed over 50,000 people at more than 50 production facilities across the entire USSR. The island wasn't perfectly contained. A 1971 field test of weaponized smallpox drifted toward the mainland city of Aralsk and killed 3 civilians, an incident the Soviet government successfully covered up for more than 30 years, until a defecting bioweapons scientist named Ken Alibek revealed the details to American officials in 1992. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the facility was abandoned in a hurry, leaving behind an estimated 200 tons of anthrax slurry buried in shallow pits, decontaminated, with little more than bleach that later testing showed had failed to fully neutralize the spores underneath. The real danger arrived later, when decades of Soviet irrigation projects drained the Aral Sea so severely that Vozrozhdeniya stopped being an island at all by the early 2000s. forming a land bridge straight to the mainland, right as post-9/11 fears about bioterrorism were reaching their peak. A joint US-Uzbek cleanup team spent the early 2000s locating and neutralizing the worst of the anthrax burial sites, backed by a $6 million American commitment, though nobody's in a rush to declare the job finished. What was once a fishing village fringed by turquoise lagoons before the bioweapons program moved in is now largely abandoned. Its Soviet-era buildings left to crumble in a landscape so dry that decay itself seems to have slowed down, preserving a strange, half-frozen snapshot of Cold War secrecy that a handful of journalists and researchers have since been permitted to briefly visit under close supervision. Number 6. Niihau, Hawaii. Nicknamed the Forbidden Island for a reason, Niihau sits just 17 miles off Kauai's coast and has been privately owned by the same family since 1864, when Elizabeth Sinclair, a 63-year-old widowed Scottish farmer traveling with hay, grain, a grand piano, and a single cow, bought the entire 70-square-mile island from King Kamehameha V for $10,000 in gold. Her descendants, the Robinson family, still control every square inch of it, and unless you're a resident, a family member, or a specifically invited guest, you are simply not getting off the boat. Kamehameha IV had reportedly offered Sinclair prime real estate around what's now downtown Honolulu instead, but she chose the more isolated island anyway, drawn to it as a lush alternative for her large family after relocating from New Zealand. The restriction hardened into policy in 1952, after a polio outbreak swept through the Hawaiian Islands, and the Robinsons sealed the island entirely to protect both the residents and themselves, requiring a 2-week quarantine for anyone who was later approved to visit. That isolation had already produced a genuinely wild historical footnote a decade earlier. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a Japanese pilot named Shigenori Nishikaichi crash-landed on Niihau, and because the island had no telephones or radio, its handful of residents had no idea the US and Japan were even at war. What followed became known as the Niihau Incident, a tense standoff that ended with the pilot's death and a Niihauan resident being posthumously awarded the Medal of Freedom for helping subdue him. The episode reportedly influenced later US military policy around the security risk posed by Japanese-American residents in Hawaii, a legacy that remains one of the more uncomfortable footnotes tied to the island's isolation. Today, roughly 70 to 80 residents still live there without paved roads or a power grid, speaking Hawaiian as their first language, while the Robinsons offer a handful of tightly controlled helicopter tours and hunting safaris just to keep the island's economy afloat. The US Navy has also leased parts of the island since 1924 for missile defense testing and radar installations, a decades-long arrangement the Robinsons have described as the lesser of two evils compared to the tourism and commercial development that opening the island fully would inevitably invite. Number 5. Runit Island, Enewetak Atoll, Marshall Islands. If you've ever seen the aerial photo of a massive concrete dome sitting incongruously on a tiny Pacific island, you've seen Runit. Between 1948 and 1958, the United States detonated 43 of its 67 total Pacific nuclear tests at Enewetak Atoll, including an 18-kiloton device called Cactus that vaporized part of Runit Island itself and sent a mushroom cloud roughly 6 kilometers into the sky, carving out the crater the island is now most famous for. More than 300 Marshallese residents had already been permanently displaced from their homeland to make way for the broader American nuclear testing program before that particular blast even occurred. Roughly 6,000 US military veterans took part in the cleanup effort that followed a generation later, many of them hauling irradiated debris in the backs of dump trucks for months on end. When American cleanup crews arrived in the late 1970s, they scraped more than 100,000 cubic yards of radioactive soil and debris off the surrounding islands and dumped it straight into that leftover crater, capping the whole thing with a concrete dome roughly 350 feet wide and just 18 inches thick, using scrap metal from old aircraft hangars to help reinforce sections of the structure. It was only ever meant to be a temporary fix, and the bottom of the crater was never lined, meaning the waste has been sitting in direct contact with the groundwater and lagoon underneath it the entire time. Marine chemist Ken Buseler at Woods Hole put it plainly, "We've known for years that the dome is leaking. Rising sea levels and cracking concrete have only added to the concern, and by some estimates, more than 99% of the original waste has already migrated into the surrounding lagoon sediment, regardless of the dome's condition. The Marshall Islands government now maintains Runit as indefinitely off-limits, closed to visitation because of the radioactive contamination still sitting just beneath that aging, sun-bleached cap. A 2020 congressional report on the site's status concluded the dome itself wasn't in imminent danger of collapse, even as it acknowledged the surrounding lagoon already carried far more contamination than what sits under the concrete. A strange kind of reassurance that amounts to admitting the damage was already done, decades before the dome ever cracked. Number 4. Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. Bikini's name has become so thoroughly detached from its origin that most people are more familiar with the swimsuit than the island it's named after. The designer reportedly named it that in 1946, specifically because he expected the garment to cause a cultural explosion comparable to the bomb tests dominating the news that same year, a marketing gamble that paid off far better than the island's own residents ever could have hoped for their situation. The actual Bikini Atoll spent 12 years, from 1946 to 1958, as the site of 23 separate U.S. nuclear tests, the most infamous being the March 1954 Castle Bravo detonation, a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima, and nearly 3 times larger than its own designers had predicted. Fallout from Castle Bravo drifted far beyond the test zone, dusting the nearby inhabited atoll of Rongelap, with what residents initially mistook for snow. Children reportedly played in it before anyone understood what it actually was, and the atoll was rendered uninhabitable almost overnight. A U.S. Navy weather forecaster had actually flagged the risk of wind-shifting fallout toward inhabited islands the night before the test, a warning that was overruled in the final planning stages. The islanders of Bikini itself had already been relocated before testing began, on the promise that they'd eventually be allowed to return home. That promise has never been kept. A 2016 scientific survey found radiation levels on Bikini Island still measuring well above internationally recognized safety standards for permanent habitation, and the International Atomic Energy Agency reached a similar conclusion decades earlier, in 1994. The atoll is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, specifically because of its haunting physical evidence of nuclear history, sunken test ships still resting in the lagoon, a Bravo crater you can see from space, and while a small number of divers and researchers are occasionally permitted to visit, nobody is calling it a vacation destination. Some Bikinian descendants, now scattered across the Marshall Islands and the United States after 5 separate forced relocations over the decades, still hold out hope of one day returning permanently, even as rising seas driven by climate change threaten to make the question moot, regardless of how the radiation eventually resolves. Number 3. Poveglia Island, Italy. Sitting quietly in the Venetian lagoon between Venice and the Lido, Poveglia has spent centuries collecting exactly the kind of history that makes a place permanently off-limits. First settled as a refuge for people fleeing barbarian invasions as far back as the 6th century, the island later became strategically important enough to fight over, most notably in a 14th century naval clash between Venice and Genoa, when residents were briefly evacuated to safety on the nearby island of Giudecca. Starting in the 1700s, ships suspected of carrying plague were routed straight to Poveglia for quarantine, and by some estimates, well over 100,000 people died and were buried there. Across the centuries. The island operated as a lazaretto, a number that led to persistent, if unverified, claims that as much as half the soil on the island is composed of human remains. The island's second act was arguably grimmer on paper. In 1922, its abandoned buildings were converted into a psychiatric hospital that operated until 1968. And while lurid stories about a doctor performing crude lobotomies and later leaping to his death from the bell tower have circulated for decades, historians researching the site note that much of this specific tale blurs documented fact with local legend rather than verified record. A sign still reading Reparto Psychiatria, or Psychiatric Department, is one of the few pieces of the asylum era that remains genuinely, physically confirmed among the ruins. What's not in dispute is the island's current legal status. It's government-owned, structurally unsound, and strictly closed to the public, with collapsing floors and unstable walls that pose a real physical hazard regardless of whether you believe a single ghost story. A 2014 auction to lease the island for private redevelopment fell apart entirely after bids came in too low. And as of a July 2025 announcement, a group of Venetian locals has instead taken over a 99-year lease with plans to turn it into a park reserved for residents, meaning Poveglia's centuries-long stretch of being genuinely, universally off-limits may finally be winding down, just not for outsiders. Even local fishermen have reportedly avoided anchoring too close to the island for generations, less out of belief in any specific curse and more out of a general, inherited discomfort with a place that spent so much of its history as a dumping ground for the sick and the forgotten. Number 2. Ilha da Queimada Grande, Brazil. Known globally as Snake Island, this 106-acre patch of Atlantic rainforest sits about 20 miles off the coast of São Paulo state, and it is, without exaggeration, entirely overrun by one of the most dangerous snakes on the planet. In 2010, the travel website Listverse voted it the most dangerous place in the world, a title that, unlike most internet superlatives, actually holds up under scrutiny. Its old name, Ilha da Queimada Grande, translates roughly to Island of the Great Fire, a reference to failed attempts by would-be settlers to burn away the vegetation and clear land for banana plantations, apparently without realizing exactly what was living in the trees they were trying to torch. The golden lancehead pit viper exists nowhere else on Earth, having evolved in total isolation after rising sea levels cut the island off from the mainland roughly 11,000 years ago, and researchers estimate the current population at somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 snakes, packed into just a fraction of the island's total land. A density some estimates place at nearly 1 snake per square meter in the most concentrated patches of forest. Cut off from any ground-based prey, the golden lancehead adapted to hunt migratory birds resting in the island's canopy, which meant evolving venom fast and potent enough to drop a bird before it could fly off. Venom that researchers estimate is 3 to 5 times stronger than that of its closest mainland relatives, and capable of causing severe internal bleeding and tissue death in a human within hours. A local lighthouse, built in 1909 and now automated, once required a keeper to live on the island full-time. According to persistent local rumor, his entire family eventually died from snake bites suffered inside their own home, though the story has never been definitively documented in any official record. Lancehead genus snakes as a group are already responsible for roughly 90% of snakebite deaths in Brazil, which gives some sense of what an island stocked exclusively with an even more potent cousin actually represents, especially given that anti-venom for the golden lancehead specifically has to be produced and stocked in advance, since generic treatments don't fully counteract its unique venom profile. The Brazilian Navy formally closed Ilha da Queimada Grande to civilians in the 1920s and has never reopened it. Today, the only people who legally set foot there are a small number of scientists working under federal permit, always accompanied by a doctor, on an island with no clean drinking water and a shoreline of cliffs steep enough to make even the boat landing genuinely dangerous before a single snake enters the picture. Local legend has long claimed pirates seeded the island with snakes to protect buried treasure, a colorful story that scientists studying the population's DNA have thoroughly debunked in favor of the far less dramatic explanation involving rising sea levels and 11,000 years of isolated evolution. Number 1. North Sentinel Island, India. And here's the island where forbidden isn't a bureaucratic label. It's an active, fatal fact reinforced within the last decade. Part of India's Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal, North Sentinel is home to the Sentinelese, one of the last uncontacted peoples on Earth, believed to number somewhere between 50 and a couple hundred individuals who have lived in isolation for tens of thousands of years and have consistently, violently resisted every outside attempt at contact, dating back at least to an 1896 encounter in which a British officer barely escaped with his life. Anthropological expeditions in the 1980s and 1990s made brief, carefully managed contact through so-called gift-dropping trips, leaving coconuts and other offerings on the shore, but even that limited engagement was eventually discontinued entirely, on the assessment that any contact at all carried more risk than benefit for a tribe with no built-up immunity to outside diseases. Indian law specifically the Andaman and Nicobar Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation of 1956, bans anyone from coming within several nautical miles of the island, a policy Indian authorities describe as eyes on, hands off, monitor from a distance, never make contact. The reasoning is straightforward and genuinely humane. The Sentinelese have no immunity to diseases as ordinary as the common cold, and even a brief, well-meaning encounter could wipe out the entire tribe, a fate that has already devastated other, less isolated Andaman tribes like the Great Andamanese and the Ongees after sustained contact with outsiders. That hasn't stopped people from trying anyway, sometimes fatally, for the visitor. In 2006, 2 fishermen who drifted too close were killed, their bodies never recovered. In November 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow paid local fishermen roughly $325 to bring him near the island, evading the exclusion zone entirely, and was killed by arrows shortly after making landfall on his second attempt in 2 days, having reportedly written in his journal that he believed the trip was a calling from God. 7 fishermen who helped him reach the island were subsequently arrested for violating the protection laws. Indian anthropologist Madhumala Chattopadhyay, one of the few outsiders ever to have safely visited the tribe decades earlier, put the entire situation about as clearly as anyone has. The tribes of the islands do not need outsiders to protect them. What they need is to be left alone. India's 2011 census, working entirely from distant observation since a closer head count is impossible, estimated only 15 Sentinelese remained on the island at the time, though experts caution that figure is likely a significant undercount given how difficult the population is to observe or verify by any conventional method. So there they are, 10 islands where paradise takes a backseat to plutonium, plague pits, venomous snakes, and a tribe that has made its boundaries lethally, unambiguously clear. A few of these places are dangerous because of what humans left behind, buried under concrete or scattered across a seafloor decades ago. A couple are dangerous because of what's always lived there, evolved over thousands of years into something the rest of the world simply has to work around. And at least one is dangerous, specifically because outsiders keep refusing to take no for an answer, no matter how many warnings, laws, or arrows make the point for them. What's striking, looking at all 10 side by side, is how differently that danger gets enforced. A legal statute here, an armed Navy patrol there, and in at least one case, a tribe defending its own front yard with nothing but bows they've used for millennia. Governments, navies, private families, and international scientific bodies all arrived at the exact same conclusion through completely different reasoning. Some places are better left alone, whether the threat is radioactive, biological, reptilian, or simply none of anybody else's business. Either way, these are 10 spots where the smartest move, by a wide margin, is admiring the view from a boat and leaving it at that. If this rundown kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and let us know in the comments which of these 10 islands surprised you the most.